come back from the feast, I guess over the years I've always felt like that perhaps the hardest sermon to give in the whole year was the sermon right after the feast. I mean, people have been to the feast. They've been hearing sermon after sermon for 8 days, all these wonderful things and variety of speakers, and they've been hearing all these things, and you come back, everybody is just, it's like, what are you going to say that has not already been said here in the last few days? It's an exciting time. We come back, we're all charged up, and we have a year ahead of us. And yet, in terms of the feast, we come back and realize just a week ago, we were all somewhere else. We were in the Ozarks, or we were up in Niagara Falls, or we were in Montreal, or we were, wherever, a whole variety of places that various ones were for the Feast of Tabernacles. Just a week has gone by. And, people have come home and generally, it begins to get hectic. Try to get home, maybe get home Sunday evening like it was this year. And for a lot of folks, then you got to turn around and be at work Monday morning. So you come in, you're tired, and if you're like me, you got a suitcase full of dirty clothes. I couldn't have stayed another day, not unless my wife had located a laundromat there, because I had timed it to expire when I got home. Well, then you got all these various things that have to be done, and you're trying to you go to the post office, you collect a stack of mail. Or stack of bills is often what that was the biggest thing that was piled up in my mail. You got all these things, and you're trying to sort of get life back on an even keel, and you're having to go to work, you're having to go to school, and you're having to try to get settled back in and get the clothes washed and get unpacked and get things sort of stored back to normalcy. And it's very easy, as a few days go by, for things to get so absorbed in all of these things, and even when a short time passes, the feast begins to seem like it was a long time ago. There is a particular book in the Bible that goes through a number of festivals and emphasizes certain things that occurred. And there are some important lessons that we can learn. There are books in the Old Testament that are that summarize much of the history of the people of God. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings make a consecutive story. You pick it up the beginning of 1st Samuel, you're in the latter time of the Judges, and you pick it up with the birth of Samuel, who was the last of the Judges, and you come on down through Samuel's life, and then the establishment of the kingship with Saul and David, and then King Solomon, and you come on down through the division of the kingdom in Israel and Judah, and Israel going into captivity, and finally Judah going into captivity. And this ends up the book of 2nd Kings. So you got this stretch, this consecutive story from the beginning of 1st Samuel to the end of 2nd Kings. 1st and 2nd Chronicles are different. They overlap much of that same material, but it is written in a totally different way. The first few chapters of 1st Chronicles begin with the genealogy, starting back with Adam, sort of track it on down and come on to David's kingship. And then most of 1st Chronicles is devoted to King David's reign over Israel. 2nd Chronicles picks up with Solomon becoming king, and 2nd Chronicles runs the story from the beginning of Solomon's reign all the way through to the time that Judah is taken captive, and then that period years later when King Cyrus came in and conquered Babylon and allowed the Jews to return. And 2nd Chronicles ends with King Cyrus's decree allowing the Jews to return. Very little in the book of Chronicles about the northern kingdom of Israel. Very little about King Saul, just very brief mention of King Saul, very only peripheral mention of some of the kings of northern Israel, very little mention about Samaria or northern Israel. But what we do have going through particularly the book of 2nd Chronicles is a story of the ups and downs and of the periods of revival and rededication that centered at the temple in Jerusalem around the feast days. And we find certain festivals. Now, the period of just 2nd Chronicles alone covers a period of over 400 years. About a little less than 450 years. In 450 years, how many feasts do you have? Well, you got 3 festival seasons each year. The Passover season, people would come up and they come back up Pentecost season, and they come back up in the fall for the Feast of Tabernacles. So hundreds and hundreds of trips that people were making over the period of that is covered in 2nd Chronicles, coming up to Jerusalem for the feast. Now, 2nd Chronicles doesn't talk about hundreds of feasts. It focuses in on certain festival periods that were significant in terms of the history of the nation. And it's an interesting story as we look at times that there were times of revival and rededication, but there's more to the story. 2nd Chronicles opens, we might just look here and look at a little bit of this story and understand as we come back from the feast. And for us, the feast is often a time of spiritual revival and rededication. We come back, we're charged up, we're on a high, we're excited, we've heard wonderful sermons, we've had great fellowship, we come back and we're really all charged up. And you get back, and you gotta go back to school, and you gotta go back to work, and you gotta get this done and that done, and this other stuff piled up while you were gone, and you get absorbed in all of these things, and it's so easy, no matter how high you were at the end of the feast, to find yourself just sort of right back in the old familiar patterns. A few weeks have gone by, and it's as though the feast never was. Now, that doesn't have to be. Let's notice the story here in 2nd Chronicles. Starts out, 2nd Chronicles chapter 1, verse 1. Solomon, the son of David, was strengthened in his kingdom, and the Lord his God was with him and magnified him exceedingly. And Solomon spoke to all Israel and all the various leaders, and he gathered them. Verse 3, they went to the high place which was at Gibeon, for there was the tabernacle of the congregation of God, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, had made in the wilderness. But the ark of God, David had brought up from Kirjath-jearim to the place that he had prepared for it. He had pitched a tent for it at Jerusalem. Do you realize, when Moses had the tabernacle built and the ark constructed after he'd come back down the mountain, you realize that, of course, the ark dwelt there in the Holy of Holies, there in the tabernacle, for a period of several centuries, about 300 years or so. Do you realize that now quite a number of years had passed since the ark was in the tabernacle? The ark, if you study the story back in 1 Samuel, and you find out that Eli's sons, Phinehas and Hophni, had taken the ark out of the tabernacle and carried it out to battle when they went out against the Philistines captured it. And then when it was returned, it never went back into the tabernacle. They took it a little ways, and when the Philistines sent it back, and there was trouble because some of the people tried to open the ark, and they were going to peep in and see what was inside. God struck thousands of them with a plague. And that solved that. Everybody all of a sudden decided to keep their hands off the ark. And then they weren't sure, what to do with it. They decided to just leave it where it was. And the ark was a couple of different places. King David was responsible for bringing it from Kirjath-jearim, where it had been for quite a while, bringing it up to Jerusalem. And he pitched a tent or a tabernacle there for it, but the tabernacle that Moses had built with all the other furniture was still at Gibeon. And then for many years it had been at Shiloh, but after this big debacle with the Philistines and the death of Eli and Phinehas and Hophni and the capture of the ark, the tabernacle, we're not told exactly when, but shortly thereafter the tabernacle was relocated away from Shiloh, and Shiloh just became an empty spot. It just became a desolate field, and there was really nothing there after then. And at this point, the tabernacle was at Gibeon, and Solomon, here at the beginning of his reign, went up to Gibeon to rededicate or to make vows to God, and God appeared to Solomon, we're told in chapter 1, verse 7, and made promises to him. In chapter 2, verse 1, we're told that Solomon determined to build a house for the name of the Eternal, and a house for his kingdom. And so he began to, he sent to, verse 3, to Hiram, king of Tyre. And they entered into certain agreements in terms of getting wood and getting things. King David had made much of these provisions, and Solomon followed up. In chapter 3, verse 1, Solomon began to build the house of the Eternal at Jerusalem in Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared unto David his father, in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. If you remember the story, God had sent a plague on Judah as a result, actually, of a sin of King David. And the death angel was literally passing through the land. And David was appealing to God to intervene and to have mercy. And you read the story there in 1 Chronicles of right over this particular spot. This is why the specific location of the temple is important, because the avenging angel stopped with his sword uplifted right over the threshing floor of Ornan, right there on the edge of Jerusalem. And that was where the plague was stopped. And David literally looked up and he saw the angel between earth and heaven standing there, stopped by God, and that right over that spot. And so that particular spot was then dedicated to God. David went to Ornan and wanted to purchase it, and Ornan said, well, look, I'll just give it to you. You know, he was impressed too. It was not just that David saw the angel. You know, a lot of people saw the angel, and the angel stopped. David said, no, he said, I don't want to, you know, this is something that I feel like I ought to do, and I want to purchase it. I don't want to acquire something for God at your expense. So David purchased it, and this was the location. Actually, the threshing floor normally was a rock, sort of an expanse of exposed rock. That's sort of a smooth expanse of exposed rock was usually what they used for threshing floor, something up on a little bit of a high spot where you tend to get more wind. And it was actually on that rock that the ark itself later was placed. And the temple and everything was built around that. Well, David acquired this spot, and he began to make arrangements for a temple being built. But God hadn't allowed David to build a temple, allowed him to make the arrangements. Now Solomon came here to build this. In chapter 3, verse 2, he began to build in the second day of the second month in the 4th year of his reign. That, in other words, just a little over 2 weeks after the Passover is when they broke ground, when they laid the foundation. And it goes through and it begins to describe in chapter 3 and chapter 4 details of the construction. And in chapter 5, verse 1, all the work that Solomon made for the house of the Lord was finished, and Solomon brought in all the things that David his father had dedicated, and all the treasures. And Solomon, verse 2, assembled the elders, and they now brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. The Ark of the Covenant had been there at right near the palace in the area of the old Jebusite citadel known as the city of David. Now it was moved a short distance from that location over into the new temple. And notice when this was. Wherefore all the men of Israel assembled themselves, this is verse 3 of chapter 5, assembled themselves unto the king in the feast which was in the 7th month. So it was the time of the fall festival. And all the elders of Israel came, and the Levites took up the ark, and they brought the ark and the tabernacle of the congregation and all the holy vessels in the tabernacle the Levites brought up. So now they had gone back to Gibeon. They took the tabernacle down. One of the advantages of the tabernacle, you could take it down and move it. Well, they went back and they took it down and they brought it up to the temple. They brought the articles of furniture that Moses had constructed in the wilderness. They brought those up to the temple. They brought some of the new items in, brought the ark in. So all of these things, everything is coming now into this new temple. And the King Solomon and the congregation were assembled. unto him before the ark. And they sacrificed sheep and oxen, which could not be told nor numbered for multitude. Just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people there, probably even, in the environs of Jerusalem, maybe even 1 million or more of people who were all gathered together. Everybody that could get there was there. And of course, when you start gathering that many people together, well, you can imagine the volume of sheep and oxen that are being slaughtered for this festive occasion. And it describes, this is all brought in. And notice, they lined up here in verse 12, all the singers, the Levitical singers and orchestra and all the musical instruments and everything, all the things were going on. And they had this tremendous concert, as it were, to dedicate the house of God. And it describes that, the trumpeters and the singers and all of the things that were there, the instruments of music. And notice the end of verse 13. They were praising God, saying He's good, His mercy endures forever. Then the house was filled with a cloud, even the house of the Eternal, so that the priest could not stand to minister by reason of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord had filled the house of God. And Solomon now begins to pray in chapter 6, and you have Solomon's prayer of dedication. In chapter 7, verse 1, Solomon, when he had made an end of praying, the fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house, and the priest couldn't enter into the house of the Lord, because the glory of the Lord had filled the Lord's house. When all the children of Israel saw how the fire came down and the glory of the Lord was upon the house, they bowed themselves with their face to the ground upon the pavement. You better believe, can you imagine standing out there and all these people are assembled and everybody is packed in and they're here and Solomon prays and there is this prayer of dedication, and when Solomon finishes, all of a sudden coming down, they can just look up and it's like this whole streak of fire that just comes straight down out of heaven and just comes down and whoosh right there on the altar, and all this great pile up of the sacrificial offerings begins to go up. You know what they primarily put on the altar was, the fat and this sort of thing was taken from the animals. You pile up something like that, and you can just imagine, this huge mound. Well, when this fire came down and it was hot, you know what happens. You know how fat burns, and so all of a sudden you had this huge shooting flame going back up, and just this amazing thing as they look here, and then it's like this cloud just descends and permeates the whole inner part of the temple, and it is just so overwhelming and overpowering that the Levites and the priests step back. They can't even enter in. Priests couldn't enter into the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord had filled the house. Just this, evidently just sort of radiating, shining cloud, that came in. Now, Solomon, verse 5, offered a sacrifice of 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. So that's quite a sacrifice. Much of that, was consumed by those who were there. So the king and all the people dedicated the house of God. And Solomon, verse 7, hallowed the middle of the court that was before the house of the Lord and offered burnt offerings because there wasn't room up there by the altar where normally it was done. Now notice verse 8. Also at the same time Solomon kept the feast 7 days, and all Israel with him, a very great congregation from the entering in of Hamath unto the river of Egypt. And in the 8th day they made a solemn assembly, for they kept the dedication of the altar 7 days and the feast 7 days. Sometimes we like to stay for an extra week. Well, they did this time. They showed up. They were there to dedicate the altar for 7 days, and that led right up. And they went right on into the Feast of Tabernacles for another 7 days. And the 8th day was a solemn assembly, the last great day. And then verse 10, the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people away into their tents, glad and merry in heart, for the goodness that the Lord had showed to David, to Solomon, and to Israel. The feast always begins on the 15th day of the 7th month. It's kept for 7 days, and the 8th day is the day of solemn assembly, the last great day. That, of course, you figured on the calendar. 15th is the beginning of the feast, and the last great day always comes on the 22nd of the 7th month. So the next day, the 23rd, you see, the day after the last great day, Solomon dismissed them and sent them away, sent everybody home. And they went home glad and merry in heart. You talk about a time of the nation rededicating itself to God, a time of excitement, a time of a spiritual high, tremendous miracles. You know, you can just imagine seeing this fire coming down from heaven, seeing the cloud, this radiating cloud representing the very glory of God filling the temple. This tremendously impressive ceremony, all these people, all of the abundance, all of the things that was going on. Solomon finished the house of the Lord, we're told in verse 11. And then in verse 12, God appeared to Solomon by night after the dedication of the temple and talked to him and made certain promises. Well, in chapter 8, at the end of 20 years, during this first 20 years of Solomon's 40-year reign, after he had built the house of the Lord in his own house and done all this great building project, we read a little more of things that began to happen, and we find that in verse 17 of chapter 8, Solomon went to Ezion-Geber and to Elat at the seaside in the land of Edom. And Hiram of Tyre, sent him by the hands of his servants ships, and servants that had knowledge of the sea. Now, Tyre was, of course, the Phoenician capital. You know, the Phoenicians established Carthage in North Africa as a colony of Tyre, and later Carthage came to far supersede Tyre in terms of size and magnitude. The Phoenicians were the greatest sailors of the ancient world. It's very interesting because there are literally there are several markers, what do you call them? Stone markers. There are things in North America, several of them that have been discovered that have inscriptions on them in Punic, the language of the Phoenicians. There are a couple of particularly good books on this that have been around for several years, and there's really no question that Phoenicians made numerous trips over a period of time to North America. We have there are several of these things that are done. All right, Solomon put together a navy, and the navy is Phoenician ships and Phoenician sailors. And Hiram sent him these ships and servants that had knowledge of the sea, the best of the Phoenician sailors. And they went with the servants of Solomon to Ophir. And they took thence 450 talents of gold and brought them to King Solomon. It comes on down in chapter 9, and it talks about the Queen of Sheba coming to King Solomon and all of these things. Now, notice as you come on down a little bit more about Solomon's navy, this Phoenician navy that he put together that went forth from Solomon, from the ports there. Verse 21 of chapter 9. The king's ships went to Tarshish. Now Tarshish is on the southern coast of Spain. You're up to the point that the ancients call the Pillars of Hercules, or the Straits of Gibraltar. This was the outlet of the Mediterranean into the Atlantic. So the king's ships went to Tarshish. So they had a port there. The term Iberia, which is the ancient name of Spain, is the ancient name of Ireland is Ibernia. This is the same term, and you study the ancient history, and the group of people called the Milesian Scots, who came from Tarshish and from that area of Spain up into Ireland. Solomon set up a colony there at Tarshish. This was a port. The king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Every 3 years once came the ships of Tarshish, bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. Now, where do you get apes? Well, you got to go way down into Africa to get apes. They had to go way down along the coast of Africa. Now, where did they get peacocks? Well, you get those back in India and Persia and that area. Well, now, as you look here, verse 22, Solomon passed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. Now, he started out, he set up this port in Tarshish over there by the Straits of Gibraltar, or the Pillars of Hercules, as they were anciently called. And they started out going west. Now, it's interesting, it mentions that these ships came back every 3 years. You know, if you remember your history, the first modern European to circumnavigate the earth was Magellan. How long did it take him to go around the earth in a sailing ship? 3 years. Now, you know, these ships that Solomon was sending out were coming back, and if you check your geography, Eilat is still a major port for Israel. That was Solomon's port in Israel. Eilat is not on the Mediterranean, it's down on the Red Sea. Now, if you start out at the Straits of Gibraltar and you end up at the bottom of the Red Sea, coming up on the other end, that means you had to, at the very minimum, you had to go all the way around Africa to do it. You started out, you went west and came back around east. It took them 3 years. Solomon had worldwide impact. It says, all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom that God had put in his heart. He passed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. You know, it talks about all this gold of Ophir, and there's a lot of speculation about where Ophir was. Some entomologists connect Ophir with the area of Peru. You know, that was the center of where a lot of the gold and the silver that came to Spain back in the 16th century came from. May very well have been. Solomon's ships were making this huge circuit. They were bringing back apes. They were bringing back peacocks. They were bringing back things from all over, from Africa, from India. This was all launched right here at the Feast of Tabernacles. You know, it was like a foretaste of the world to come. This was, this impressive Feast of Tabernacles. The very glory of God was manifested. And it launched something that was of tremendous magnitude. The wealth, the scope of things, just absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. And yet, as you go on through the rest of the story, we find a few years later what happened. King Solomon loved many strange women. He didn't just bring back apes and peacocks from around the world. He loved many strange women. In fact, you wind up, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And we're told that these Solomon's wives, in his old age, his heart wasn't perfect toward God. His wives turned away his heart, and he began to allow idol temples and idolatrous shrines and altars to be set up right in Jerusalem. Now, here is a tremendous event. You read of this Feast of Tabernacles that inaugurated the very glory of the reign of Solomon. Solomon's name means peace. It was a type of the world to come. There are two places in the Bible that describes a time when every man will sat under his own vine and his own fig tree, and none will make him afraid. Once that phrase is used in the prophets to refer to the world to come, tomorrow's world. And it's also used back in Kings to refer to the reign of King Solomon. That in Israel in those days, every man sat under his own vine, his own fig tree. None did make him afraid. So Solomon's reign was a type of the world tomorrow. It was inaugurated here at this glorious Feast of Tabernacles, this temple where God's direct intervention to consume the sacrifices, to fill the house with glory, all of the excitement, people came away on a high. And the prosperity and the greatness of the nation grew. Solomon, who was there, he saw all of those things. God appeared directly to Solomon Twice, once at Gibeon and once there after the dedication of the temple with promises. God came to him in a dream and God talked to him. God dealt with Solomon in a special way. Solomon saw all of these things. He was there. He saw the glory of God manifested. And yet, as the years went by, Solomon drifted. That glorious Feast of Tabernacles, the most incredible of festivals, didn't solve the problem forever, did it? You know, the glory of that feast began to wear off in people's minds, and they got sidetracked with this and sidetracked with that. As you come on through the story here, Solomon died here in the end of chapter 9. In chapter 10, Rehoboam, his son, became king. And Rehoboam died as we come on down through the story after a reign of about 18 years. Actually 17 years as it is in chapter 12, verse 13. And his son Abijah became king. And Abijah reigned 3 years, chapter 13, verse 2. Here we're only 20 years down after the time of King Solomon now. Now 20 years ago was not very long. 20 years ago, 1979. Doesn't seem very long ago. Chapter 14 tells us that Abijah slept with his fathers and they buried him. So this is 20 years after Solomon's death. His son and his grandson have had brief reigns. And now, his great-grandson, Asa, becomes king. And we're told in verse 2, Asa did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord. He took away the altars of the strange gods and the high places and broke down the images and cut down the groves. Commanded Judah to seek the Lord God of their fathers and to do the law and the commandments. In a relatively short period of time, it wasn't just that Solomon allowed his wives to put up these idolatrous shrines and nobody went there. No, what you find as you go on down through the story is people flocked to these things. They flocked to these idolatrous shrines and they were worshiping. Here 20 years after Solomon's death, Asa becomes king. The first thing he does, he begins to cut down all these idolatrous groves and shrines and tear all these things down. And these things that took place, people very soon got away, even though they had seen this tremendous, impressive display of the glory of God. They lost sight of where all of the blessings came from. Now, Asa, who had become king, started trying to clean things up and to get rid of that idolatry. And 10 years went by and things were pretty peaceful. And the land had rest, we're told in verse 6. Then, Asa had built up an army, and he thought he had a pretty impressive army. And then in verse 9, there came out against him Zerah the Ethiopian. And Zerah the Ethiopian had 1,000,000-man army. And Asa went out against him, and they set the battle in array. In verse 11, Asa cried unto the Eternal his God and said, Lord, it is nothing with you to help, whether with many or with them that have no power. Help us, O Lord our God, we rest on you. And in your name we go against this multitude. O Lord, you're our God, let not man prevail against you. And so the Lord smote the Ethiopians before Asa and before Judah. And the Ethiopians fled. You know, if the army of Ethiopia had been considerably smaller, Asa would have been greatly tempted to just take this army out and say, well, you know, I got a pretty good sized army. In fact, I've got as many men as they do, maybe have a few more. I'll just go out and put it to them. But there's something about being overwhelmed, facing overwhelming odds. You see, God allows us to get in situations where we're confronted with our total inability to deliver ourselves. It's easy humanly, sometimes when things are going pretty smoothly, to get an illusion of self-sufficiency. Well, you know, I've got this done. I can take care of that. God let Asa was going along. Asa was trying to do what was right, and he was coming along pretty well. And several years went by, and then this huge army came. God could have gotten rid of the army before then. He could have gotten them diverted, gotten them turned away, sort of put it into the mind of this Ethiopian monarch to go somewhere else. But God let Asa get in a situation where he was confronted with his utter helplessness. He was so totally outnumbered with this huge army, most massive army put together up until this time. And it was overwhelming to him. And at the point where we're absolutely overwhelmed and we can't figure any way out, well, it sort of helped him focus. Focus on the fact that God had to deliver him or he was dead. We're told back in Deuteronomy 8 that one of the reasons God led Israel in the wilderness to 40 years, He says to humble you and to prove you. And He talked about that during those 40 years, how He humbled them was He put them in a situation where He provided their food, He provided their water, their clothes didn't wear out, their shoes didn't wear out. God put them in the middle of one of the most desolate places on the face of the earth. And there was absolutely nothing they could do to provide for themselves. And then God provided for them. He humbled them. He put them in a situation where they were confronted with their total inability to provide for themselves. Somehow, if we do a little bit, we sort of take the credit. Somebody goes out and they plant a seed and a bunch of seed and garden grows up and they say, look what I grew. Boy, I really provided for my family here. Boy, we got all this food. Now you take a little grain of corn. Now, that's an incredible thing. You take that grain of corn, you plant it, and a stalk comes up. This huge, great big stalk, and ears come out, and they're loaded with grains of corn, and all you put was one little grain of corn in the ground. There was life in that grain. There was something in there, and here, this great big plant, and all this food is produced as a result of one little tiny grain that you put in the ground. Are you the one that made the grain grow? No. You put it in the ground, God's the one that made it grow. You see, even when we think we've done it, it's really God is the one who's made it possible. But somehow when we have a part in it, we get to thinking that we get to focusing on what we've done. So from time to time, God lets us get in a situation where we don't have any wiggle room. There's nothing we can do. We can't fix it. And it's in situations like that we begin to focus on the fact of how much we need God and how powerless we are. Because we never turn loose to something as long as we're convinced we can take care of it. But when we come to the point that we know that we're powerless, we accept our inability to fix it. At that point, then you can turn it over to God because there's really no other option. God let Asa get in a situation like that. He wanted him to confront it, and Asa cried out to God, and he begged God to please intervene, and he said, look, it doesn't matter how big the army is. I'm overwhelmed, but you're not. So God intervened, took care of the army. And God sent a prophet, a man by the name of Azariah, mentioned here in chapter 15, verse 1. And he told Asa that the Lord is with you while you be with him. This is on down in verse 2. If you seek him, he'll be found of you. If you forsake him, he'll forsake you. For a long season, Israel had been without the true God, without a teaching priest, without the law. Solomon had been dead 20 years, and going back prior to Solomon's death, Israel had been without the true God. But when they in their trouble did turn to the Lord their God and sought him, he was found of them. So Asa heard these words, verse 8, he took courage. He put away the abominable idols out of all the land of Judah and Israel, out of the cities he had taken from Mount Ephraim. He renewed the altar of the Lord that was before the porch of the Lord. So that had evidently fallen into disuse and disrepair. He gathered all Judah and Benjamin and the strangers with them out of Ephraim and Manasseh and out of Simeon, for they fell to him out of Israel in abundance when they saw that the Lord his God was with him. So they gathered themselves together at Jerusalem in the 3rd month, in the 15th year of the reign of Asa. The 3rd month is Pentecost. They came here at the time of Pentecost, and what did they do? Verse 12, they entered into a covenant to seek the Lord their God with all their heart and with all their soul. They renewed the covenant. That was the covenant they had made with God at Sinai on the first Pentecost. Now they assemble here at the time of Pentecost. They all come up to Jerusalem, and they enter into a covenant to seek God with all their heart. And so there was a period, this was the 15th year of Asa's reign, and things went smoothly for 20 years. No more war, verse 19, until the 35th year of his reign. Here was a time of encouragement. It was a festival celebration. They came, they rededicated themselves. It was a time of revival and rededication. And they acted on it, and they cleaned things up. They got away from idolatry. And years went by. Peaceful years, prosperous years. Things rocked on for about 20 years. Chapter 16, verse 1, the 36th year of the reign of Asa, Baasha, the king of Israel, came up against Judah. Now, Baasha was a little more, he was a little more of an even match than Zerah the Ethiopian. Baasha didn't overwhelm Asa in the same way, and so Asa decided, he had the solution for that. He had a lot of silver and gold, things had built up, and he was going to send this bribe up to the king of Damascus, the king of Syria located in Damascus, and get him to attack Baasha. So he was going to enter into this alliance, and he was going to fix his problem. He was going to solve it. Well, as we come on down, God sent a prophet to Asa. God was not impressed with this. Verse 7. He told Asa, he said, because you relied on the king of Syria and have not relied on the Lord your God, therefore is the host of the king of Syria escaped out of your hand. Weren't the Ethiopians and the Lubim a huge host, with very many chariots and horsemen? Yet because you did rely on the eternal, he delivered them into your hand. The eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong in the behalf of them whose heart is perfect toward him. You have done foolishly. From now on, you're going to have wars. You see, Asa now didn't feel overwhelmed. He thought he could handle this thing with Baasha. And so he takes money and takes treasure, some of which had even piled up in the temple, sends it up here, gets involved in this alliance, and he's going to maneuver and fix things. And God sends a prophet, and he said, you've done foolishly. Way back when, you went to God, and you besought God to intervene, and God intervened and delivered you. Now, you've tangled yourself up in a mess, and you're going to have nothing but strife and war. You can't, if you do things this way, you're going to have difficulties. Now, verse 10, Asa was wroth with the seer and put him in the prison house. Asa was mad. You see, these years of peace and prosperity, Asa was a proud man. He was proud of what, quote, he had accomplished. He wasn't going to let anybody talk to him like that. Made him mad, to be correct. And, of course, he threw the prophet in jail, and then Asa got sick. He wasn't going to let the prophet out of jail and ask him to come pray for him. Oh, no. So, Asa died. Asa was a hard-headed fella. And pride can really blind a person. Pride can blind a person to being able to really see things in proper perspective. Asa's pride had gotten in the way. Now here was a tremendous miracle. This overwhelming army had been dispersed. This great festival of Pentecost, great time of rededication to God. People came away and they were all charged up and they went out and they smashed idols and they got rid of everything they could find. And things went on along. There was a time of peace, a time of prosperity. But peace and prosperity are very conducive to creating a Laodicean attitude, aren't they? An attitude of complacency, an attitude of feeling rich and increased with goods, sort of feeling self-sufficient. You see, Asa didn't feel nearly as much in need of God now as he had earlier. But of course the reality was he still needed God. You see, this time of revival, this time of rededication, it lasted for a while, but it trailed off, and here were some of the very ones who were involved in it that got off the track. Well, the nation continued to deteriorate. Asa died, and his son Jehoshaphat became king. Now, Jehoshaphat is a very interesting person. He was a man who's really had his heart was in wanting to obey God. He was a man who sought to do what was right. But Jehoshaphat, well, as I read the story, I think Jehoshaphat was one of these fellows who was never, filled with guile and all out to do things, not a person that had an evil agenda, and it was very difficult for him to believe that other people did. In other words, Jehoshaphat was the sort of fellow that if you were out peddling something, he's the kind of guy you'd want to look up, because you could probably sell him no telling what. Jehoshaphat kept getting sucked into trying to help old Ahab. Ahab was the king up in Israel, and he was as wicked a king as Israel ever had. But Jehoshaphat felt sorry for him, and Ahab would come to him with his hard luck story and get Jehoshaphat to try to bail him out. And Jehoshaphat was a good-hearted fellow, and he'd do it. And I think the prime example of sort of the height of gullibility, Jehoshaphat and Ahab had come up to have a meeting, and Jehoshaphat said, we need to ask a prophet of God whether to go out to battle. The prophet of God came and told him, said, by all means, go out to battle. Then he looked at Ahab and he said, you're going to die. I saw Israel scattered like sheep without a shepherd. Go ahead. You go to battle. Well, Ahab was a little nervous about that. So we're told Ahab tells Jehoshaphat, said, I tell you what, you put on your royal robes and stick the crown on your head and get in the chariot and take off and lead the troops. I'll come too, but I'm just going to wear some sort of old grubby clothes. Now, a person doesn't have to be too smart to sort of figure out who is going to be obviously the king. If they're gunning for the king, there's only going to be one guy out there that looks like the king. Now, Jehoshaphat was gullible because he bought it. Sounds like a good idea to me. And he went on out there. And we're told that the troops came in, they saw Jehoshaphat, and they headed for him. They got close, and somebody recognized, no, that's not Ahab. And so they turned away. God had mercy on him. And it talks about an archer who just sort of shot an arrow. Just a chance arrow. Well, it wasn't really a chance arrow because you can't outsmart God. Old Ahab, who was over here disguised, looked like a common soldier. The arrow just pierced right through him and killed him. Jehoshaphat had even allowed his son, the heir to the throne of David, to marry Ahab's daughter, Athaliah. And Athaliah was a real chip off the old block, or the block was her mother Jezebel. You remember dear Athaliah, she was the one responsible for trying to kill all her grandchildren to make herself queen. And, real nice lady. So you have to say, Jehoshaphat, as you go through and you read the story, Jehoshaphat was not real perceptive of people and motives. He was good-hearted. He was a man who tried to obey God, but he was lacking in discernment, and so he got taken advantage of, sort of going and coming. And you can go through and read the story, and things continued on through these events, and his finally, after all these problems with his son and grandson died very quickly, and this daughter-in-law took over as queen, and then finally she was replaced by Joash, her little grandson. A little time goes by, and Judah gets in worse and worse shape. And so in chapter 29 of 2 Chronicles, we pick up the story again. Hezekiah began to reign. And when Hezekiah, we're told in verse 2, he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. In the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. The temple had fallen into disrepair. Hezekiah became king. First thing he started to do was to clean up the temple. The very temple that Solomon had dedicated at that Feast of Tabernacles. Well, Hezekiah tried to get things together. In chapter 30, verse 1, he sent to all Israel and Judah, wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh that they should come to the house of the Lord at Jerusalem to keep the Passover unto the Lord God of Israel. Now, the time period of when Hezekiah came to the throne was a time when Israel was already had been subjugated by the Assyrians. The Assyrians had already come in and occupied northern Israel, or much of it, had begun deporting people into captivity. And this deportation took place over a period of years as they were doing this. Hezekiah came to the throne just about this time when, right at just after the beginning of the captivity. And he sent letters out to all the remnants of Israel that had not gone into captivity and invited them to come keep the Passover. And as you come on down, the king had taken counsel, and they had to keep the Passover in the second month. You know, God made provision back in the book of Numbers through Moses for a second Passover. This is the only occasion where the whole nation kept it at the second Passover. But when Hezekiah took over as king, the temple was a mess. It was polluted. It was a wreck. And they started in as quickly as they could, but they couldn't get it all fixed in 2 weeks, which was all he had. He started at the beginning of the first month. First year of his reign. Well, Passover comes in the middle of the month, you see. So, it was the second month before, they had things ready. So he talked with took counsel, evidently talked to the priests and perhaps the prophet Isaiah, who was God's servant at that time. And they said, well, this would be an appropriate time for the whole nation to keep the second Passover. So the king sent out, this decree, and noticed verse 6, posts went with the letters from the king and his princes throughout all Israel and Judah, according to the commandment of the king, saying, you children of Israel, turn again unto the Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, and he will return to the remnant of you that are escaped out of the hand of the kings of Assyria. Don't be like your fathers and your brethren, which trespassed against the Lord. Coming on down, verse 9, if you turn again unto the Lord, your brethren and your children shall find compassion before them that lead them captive, so that they shall come again into this land, for the Lord your God is gracious and merciful, and he won't turn away his face from you if you return to him. And the post passed from city to city throughout the country of Ephraim and Manasseh, even to Zebulun, but they laughed them to scorn and mocked them. There were a few different ones from Asher and Manasseh and Zebulun that humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. And so these people, verse 13, assembled at Jerusalem much people to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the second month, a very great congregation. Here they come, a time of assembling before God at the festivals, a time of rededication, a time of renewal, a time of revival spiritually. It was the last chance northern Israel had to avert complete captivity and deportation. And what we find, of course, is that most people just laughed to scorn God's warning through Hezekiah. But there were a few individuals that came up, and they isolated people here and there that came up there to Jerusalem to keep the feast. You know, that's when you read back in the book of Luke about this elderly lady, Anna, who was very elderly, had dwelt there in the temple for many years, and you're told that she was the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. Well, how did you have somebody in the tribe of Asher that showed up? Well, evidently, we find there were a few from Asher that showed up that responded to Hezekiah's warning. So she was evidently a descendant of one of those. You see, there were individuals who responded who were protected. Here was a great time of revival. And verse 21, Hezekiah spoke comfortably to the Levites, and he taught the good knowledge of the Lord. They did eat throughout the feast 7 days, made peace offerings, made confession to the Lord God of their fathers. The whole assembly took counsel to keep another 7 days. And so they kept an extra 7 days with gladness. And Hezekiah gave the congregation 1,000 bullocks and 7,000 sheep. And the princes gave 1,000 bullock and 10,000 sheep. A great number of priests sanctified themselves. They had so much fun keeping the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they said, let's just go another week. One example here, they kept it for 2 weeks. They were excited. They were just filled with zeal and excitement. In fact, verse 25, all the congregation of Judah with the priests and the Levites and all the congregation that came out of Israel and the strangers that came out of the land of Israel that dwelt in Judah rejoiced. There was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there was not the like in Jerusalem. And the priests and the Levites arose and blessed the people. Their voice was heard. Their prayer came up to his holy dwelling place, even to heaven. When it was all finished, all Israel that were present went out to the cities of Judah, and they broke the images in pieces, cut down the groves, threw down the high places, and the altars out of all Judah and Benjamin, and Ephraim also and Manasseh, until they had utterly destroyed them all. And they all returned, every man to his possession. Hezekiah appointed the courses of the priests and the Levites, and you go on as to the things that happened. And verse 7, the third month, they began to lay the foundation of the heaps, finished them in the 7th month. So they came back for Pentecost, and then again for the Feast of Tabernacles. Pentecost is in the 3rd month, and Tabernacles comes in the 7th month. A time of revival, a time of restoration. People left and they were zealous. They went out and they destroyed everything they could find that smacked of idolatry. And yet, of course, God then went on and performed a great miracle. You can read the story of how the Assyrian army that came on down through northern Israel came on up, encamped around Jerusalem, and Hezekiah besought God, and God intervened and destroyed the whole Assyrian army. And yet, Hezekiah died, his son Manasseh took over, and idolatrous shrines were rebuilt, and all sorts of horrible things began to happen, and people went along with it. After all these miracles and all these things. And Manasseh's son reigned for a short time, 2 years, and then his little 8-year-old grandson, Josiah, became king. And Josiah, as soon as he began to get on up into his teenage years to where he assumed certain responsibility, had a zeal for the truth. And you read of how the temple began to be repaired, and they discovered again the book of the law. That's here in chapter 34, verse 14 and 15 and 16. And the king gathered together the people. Verse 30. The king, Josiah, went up into the house of the Lord, and all the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests and the Levites, and they all came, and he read in their ears all the words of the book of the covenant, which is found in the house of the Lord. He stood in his place and made a covenant before God to walk after the Lord, to keep his commandments, his testimonies, his statutes with all his heart and all his soul. And everybody there said, oh yes, we're going to do the same thing. Verse 33, Josiah took away the abominations, got rid of all the things that were idolatrous. Chapter 35, verse 1, Josiah kept a Passover to the Lord in Jerusalem. They kept this great Passover feast of rededication, of revival. And it describes this tremendous festival and what occurred. And we're told in verse 17, the children of Israel that were present kept the Passover at that time, the Feast of Unleavened Bread 7 days, and there was no Passover like to that kept in Israel from the days of Samuel the prophet. Neither did all the kings of Israel keep such a Passover as Josiah kept. A tremendous time of revival and rededication. This was in the 18th year of his reign. And yet, within a short time, a few years, Josiah was dead. His sons took over. And in a relatively short period of time, less than 25 years from the time of this great Passover, King Nebuchadnezzar had invaded the land and was beginning to take Judah into captivity. The people had gotten off the track. They were there, they participated in this great time of revival and restoration, and yet it didn't last. Over and over and over again, we see that. We've come through an inspiring Feast of Tabernacles. And you know, you come out of something like this and you say, boy, this is going to be great, this is wonderful. Well, the real question is, what difference will it make? What difference will it make in your life? What changes will you make in your life as a result of the feast? Because you know, the natural, normal thing is to fall back into all the old patterns. Oh, we come out and we're all charged up, we're going to do this, and we're just on a high. But the natural, normal thing is to fall back into old patterns. And the only reason we don't fall back into those old patterns is that we evaluate what patterns are present in our lives and what changes you need to make. You know, the most fundamental area of our lives gets back to our relationship with God. Prayer, Bible study, fasting. You know, if we want permanent changes in our life as a result of this revival, this renewal of the feast, then we have to start out by evaluating the patterns in our life. Patterns of prayer, patterns of Bible study, patterns of fasting. Are we renewing the inward man day by day? You know, first thing you have to do is step back and look at something, evaluate it, see it, and then make plans as to what you're going to do about it. You know, when we evaluate the patterns of prayer and Bible study in our lives, and we begin to look at it, to set a goal and say, well, you know, I'm going to do better this year. You know, that's an easy goal to set. Everybody says, well, I want to do better. That's great. But you know, that's an unmeasurable goal. You can't. What do you mean I'm going to do better? The only thing, a goal in order to be meaningful has to be realistic, and it also has to be measurable. It's got to be some way of evaluating as to whether or not you're making progress in that way. You know, and it involves an evaluation of the patterns of our whole life, because person is staying up till all hours of the night or the wee hours of the morning, and they're not going to be able to consistently get up early enough to pray and study in order to go and be at work. You got to start that pattern the evening before. You know, God begins the day at sunset, and really, you set the pattern for the daylight hours by what you do the night before, because that's going to determine the way you're feeling and the shape you're in. And you're not going to burn the candle at both ends for too long. Sooner or later, you're going to think, when the alarm goes off, boy, I think I need a little more sleep. I'll catch up tomorrow. I'll catch up this evening. And the patterns begin to be disrupted. If we're going to make changes in our lives, we have to evaluate what are the patterns of our life. What are our patterns in terms of prayer, in terms of Bible study, in terms of fasting? Are we satisfied with those patterns? Do those really reflect what is needed? And if we're going to make changes, then what are the new patterns that need to be set? You see, those are things we have to evaluate. What about patterns in our family life, in our marriage, or with our children? Again, we have to step back and look at, identify, evaluate what are the patterns that are present right now. How many of these patterns am I satisfied with? What needs to be modified? What needs to be changed? You see, unless we're consciously making changes, then unconsciously we'll slip right back into the old patterns and the old habits. Because, let's face it, if it was easy and simple to be different than the way we are, we'd already be different. We're the way we are because that's sort of the pattern we have. The heart is deceitful above all things. It's hard to really be honest with ourselves. to honestly look at what these patterns are. Well, God already knows what they are. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know what they are too. And we look at them, we evaluate them, and maybe some of those patterns are pretty good. Maybe some of those patterns are pretty healthy. That's great. But I doubt that 100% of those patterns are good. I doubt that all of them are to a point that there's nothing really you can do to improve on it. So we have to evaluate, look at it, and then say what changes, what patterns need to be altered. Evaluate the whole set of priorities that we have in our life. In terms of money, in terms of time, in terms of everything. Just step back and just look at what are those priorities. And are those really the priorities that I want? Evaluating our patterns of service. How are we, to what extent and in what ways are we helping and giving and serving? Evaluating all of the patterns of our life. Stepping back, looking at it, realizing. You see that for the period of revival and renewal that takes place at the festivals, for that to have long-term value, there have to be changes in the patterns of our life. When ancient Israel returned from the feast, it was a time to sow the grain fields. The early rains came in November and December, and it was then in the spring when the grain began to emerge from the ground, and they began the harvest there right after the Passover, between Passover and Pentecost, beginning with the barley harvest on through the wheat harvest. Well, the seed that they planted right after the feast is what determined next year's crop, next year's yield. The actions that they took at that time determined what kind of feast they were going to have the next year. Without conscious change, you and I continue to drift in old patterns. That's what comes naturally. We look through the Bible and we see times of incredible renewal and rededication, great outpourings of miracles from God, great zeal and response from the people. But we see that when the emotions of the moment wore off, things slid along and nothing permanent was achieved. Over and over and over, there were these needs for revival and renewal. The only way something permanent is going to be achieved in our lives is to the extent that we really evaluate and examine the patterns of our lives and go to God for the help to implement new and healthy patterns. We need times of reevaluation. We also need to understand as we do this, that it's a time to ensure the success of the feast. The success of the feast of 1999 is yet to be determined. It's determined by the results in your life and in my life. How successful was the feast for me? How successful was it for you? Well, we're going to write that story over the course of the next year and over the future in our lives. Let's remember that right now, you and I are planting the seeds of next year's crop. Let's make it a good one.